The first lie of the day was the silence. It wasn't real. Not really. It was a carefully constructed thing, built from holding her breath as she moved through the cramped apartment, from the way she placed a spoon on the counter without a sound. Before she could move, she paused, listening. In the other room, her son, Leo, slept on. And his sleep was the most precious thing she owned. The pre-dawn light was a dirty gray film over the window pane, and the world outside was still a ghost. Inside, she meticulously sliced the crusts from a slice of bread. Leo, at 5, had declared them the enemy, a great and terrible injustice upon the sandwich-eating world. So she performed this ritual every morning. Maybe it was fate that this was one of the few indulgences she could afford him. A shield, this tiny act of love, a way to pretend that their world wasn't all sharp, hard edges. Deep down, she knew the truth. Their world was nothing but sharp edges. Moments later, she was staring at her own reflection in the cracked mirror by the door. The girl who had laughed under a canopy of summer stars was gone. In her place was a woman with her jaw set like stone and eyes that held the permanent exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. You are unworthy. The echo of her father's voice was a serpent coiling in her gut. She pushed it down, locking it away. She had to, because for Leo, she had to be more than a disappointment. She had to be a fortress, which meant the diner was her battlefield. The Havenwood Diner was a symphony of clattering plates, the angry hiss of the griddle, and the thick, clinging smell of stale coffee. It was the same every day. The same faces, the same whispers. They saw her, but they didn't. Instead, they saw the cautionary tale she'd become. "More coffee, hun?" she asked Mr. Henderson, forcing a smile that felt like cracking glass. He grunted, his eyes never leaving the morning paper. "Just leave the pot." The smile didn't break. It was part of the uniform. At the same time, her mind was a frantic calculator, adding up the potential tips. 50 cents from Henderson, $1 from booth 4. Maybe. The numbers were a desperate rhythm, a frantic drumbeat against the inside of her skull. It was the sound of survival. Then came the voice, slick with cheap confidence. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," it drawled from a corner booth. Mark, a ghost from high school, his face now bloated with beer and small-town satisfaction. "Still slinging hash, Arya?" Her spine went rigid. "Hello, Mark, the special's meatloaf." He snickered to his friends, a wet, ugly sound. "I bet." A hot blush crawled up her neck. Fury and shame, a familiar cocktail. She turned away, her knuckles white around the handle of the coffee pot. "Invisible," she chanted to herself. "Just be invisible." Eventually, during a lull, her boss, Sal, called her to the back. His office smelled like bleach and desperation. "Arya," he began, wiping his sweaty palms on his apron. "Got a proposition, big one." Her stomach tightened. Nothing good ever started with that word. "Big catering gig," he continued, his voice dropping. "Up at the Forrester estate, a peace summit, between us and, well, them." He jerked his head towards the dark woods that bordered the town, towards the shifter territories, the place of nightmares. "Pays triple my rate. Cash. They need servers who know how to be quiet. People who know how to keep their heads down." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You came to mind." Her heart started to pound, a heavy, frantic thud against her ribs. Shifters. Men who were more beast than human. A world she had been taught to fear. But then he named a number. A stunning, brilliant number that sang in her mind. It wasn't just money. It was a security deposit. It was new sneakers for Leo. It was a bus ticket so far away from Havenwood that no one would ever whisper her name again. It was escape. "I don't know, Sal," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just one night," he pressed, leaning forward. "In and out. They're trying to be all diplomatic. High-born wolves they are, civilized. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of uncivilized wolves or the ones who pretended to be civilized. But then she thought of Leo's worn-out shoes. She thought of the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. In that moment, she knew she had no choice. The fear was a block of ice in her stomach, but the hope was a tiny, defiant flame. As the silence stretched, she took a deep breath. "Okay," she said, her voice a ghost of its former self. "I'll do it."
The cold of the sunstone throne seeped through the fine wool of his tunic, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air and everything to do with the stone itself. It was a throne carved from the heart of a monolith, ancient and unforgiving, and some days Rowan felt as though it were leaching the very warmth from his bones. He was the Alpha King, a ruler, a predator, and he was a man with a hole carved through his soul. "The Silver Moon delegation grows impatient, my king." Rowan's eyes snapped to the man standing before him. Lord Kale. Elder of the Wolf Council, his face a mask of placid respectability, but his scent, ozone and ambition, told a different story. The air in the great hall was thick with the smell of old stone, beeswax, and the stifling weight of tradition. "They are always impatient, Kale." Rowan's voice was flat, echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "It is their nature." "It is their nature to want security," Kale countered smoothly, his voice a low, reasonable baritone that had swayed councils for 50 years. "An alliance, a union, a marriage. These are the cornerstones of a lasting peace. Your betrothal to Lady Seraphina is more than a promise, it is a shield for our people." Rowan's jaw tightened. Seraphina, a high-born she-wolf, beautiful, powerful, and a complete stranger, a political asset, another chain. "My duty to our people is not in question." "Of course not," Kale agreed, his silver-streaked hair gleaming in the torchlight. "But a king needs a queen. And more importantly, the kingdom needs an heir. A true heir, born of 2 alpha lines. It would silence the whispers. Solidify your reign." Whispers. Kale's words were chosen with the precision of a surgeon. The whispers he spoke of were about the gap, the blank space, the 3 days years ago that were completely gone from his memory. The official story was a border skirmish, a blow to the head, a miraculous recovery, a neat, tidy lie. But deep down, he knew the truth, or rather, the lack of it. It was a phantom limb. He could feel its absence, a constant irritating ache that no one else could see. What's worse, he sometimes caught a scent on the wind, wildflowers and summer rain, that made the wolf inside him stir with a violent, possessive longing for something it couldn't name. It was madness. "The peace summit with the human envoys is tomorrow," Rowan stated, deflecting. "That is my priority." "A distraction," Kale said, the first hint of steel in his voice. "A necessary courtesy, nothing more. Your legacy, Rowan, will not be written in handshakes with fragile humans. It will be written in the blood of your children, in the strength of your line." Rowan rose from the throne, his sheer size and presence forcing Kale to take a half-step back. The Alpha King was not a title, it was a physical reality, a pressure in the air, a promise of violence held in perfect, rigid control. "My legacy," Rowan growled, the sound a low rumble in his chest, "is mine to write. Do you forget who is king?" Kale bowed his head, the picture of deference. "Never, my king. I live only to serve the throne." Liar. The word screamed in Rowan's mind. Kale served the council. He served tradition. He served his own vision of the future. Whether Rowan was a part of it, that remained to be seen. "The summit will proceed," Rowan said, his voice dropping to a dismissive whisper that was more threatening than any shout. "Ensure the delegation is comfortable. And Kale." He paused until the elder met his gaze. "Do not speak to me of my legacy again." Without another word, Rowan swept from the hall, the weight of his crown, both real and imagined, settling heavily upon him. He stalked through the cold, echoing corridors of the Sunstone Citadel, a fortress that felt more like a prison every day. He needed air. He needed something. As he stood on a high balcony overlooking the vast, dark forest, a gust of wind brought it to him again. Faint, almost imperceptible, wildflowers and rain. A growl rose in his throat, raw and frustrated. His wolf clawed at the inside of his chest, hungry for a memory that wasn't there. He didn't know what it was, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the mountain air, that something had been stolen from him, and he was the king of a world built on the lie that he was whole. The peace summit was a distraction, Cale had said, as if fate demanded it. He found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, a distraction was exactly what he needed.
The moment she stepped inside the Forrester estate, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The air itself felt different. Rich. It smelled of beeswax, old money, and flowers, whose names she didn't know. Crystal glasses chimed like tiny bells, and the low murmur of conversation was a language she didn't speak, a world away from the clatter and grease of the diner. She was a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. Her uniform, clean and pressed that morning, suddenly felt like a costume made of sackcloth. Her one goal was to be a ghost, a shadow that refilled glasses and then vanished. Because of that, she kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched, a phantom in the service of the elite. Truth be told, a part of her was terrified, but another, smaller part was fascinated. She saw women draped in silks, their laughter light and effortless. She saw men in tailored jackets, their power worn as easily as their clothes. This was a life she couldn't even imagine, and for a moment she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like. What would it be like to belong? But then, a flicker of movement across the grand hall snagged her attention. A man, taller than the rest, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his immaculate black coat. He stood with his back to her, a commanding presence that seemed to bend the very light around him. The air crackled with his authority. A king. Without thinking, her feet froze. Her tray of empty glasses suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. It's not him, she told herself, her heart starting a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. It can't be. That was years ago. A dream. A mistake. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't look away. As if pulled by a string, he turned. Just a fraction. And she saw his profile. The world stopped. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a memory. It was him. The sharp line of his jaw, the dark, thick hair, the mouth that had once whispered her name in the dark. But he was harder now, colder. The boy she had known was gone, and in his place was a man forged from steel and shadow, the Alpha King. Her breath caught, a painful little hitch in her chest. All the air had been stolen from the room, from her lungs, from the world. Her carefully constructed life, her fragile peace, it was all just a house of cards, and a hurricane had just walked into the room. She had to leave. Now. Her body moved on instinct, turning to flee back to the kitchens, back to the shadows where she belonged. She could say she was sick. She could forfeit the money. She didn't care. Nothing was worth this. But then, it was too late. The moment their eyes locked across the crowded room, time stood still. For a single agonizing heartbeat, his gaze swept over her with blank, cold indifference. Nothing, not a flicker of recognition. The cut was so deep, so swift, she felt the phantom pain of it in her soul. He had forgotten her completely. The relief should have been overwhelming. Instead, it was just hollow. She began to turn away again, the ghost she was meant to be. But then, something shifted. His head snapped back in her direction, his body going rigid. The casual disinterest in his eyes vanished, replaced by a raw, predatory intensity that pinned her to the spot. His nostrils flared just slightly, and his eyes blazed with a shocking, violent fire. It was a look of disbelief, of fury, of something so primal it made the hairs on her arms stand on end. He still didn't know who she was. Deep down, she knew the truth. It was worse. It was as if his very soul recognized her, and his mind was at war with it. Without warning, he took a step in her direction, and the ghost had just become the prey.
The droning voice of the human envoy was a dull, irritating buzz, like a fly trapped against a window pane. Rowan stood with a glass of wine he hadn't touched, his face a mask of regal patience, a mask he had perfected over a decade of tedious diplomacy. He nodded in the right places. He maintained the illusion of interest. But inside, his wolf paced the confines of its cage, bored and restless. The hall was too hot. The scents of human perfume and cooked meat were cloying, and the political maneuvering was a game he had long since tired of playing. Kyle was right. This was a distraction. He was scanning the crowd, his eyes cataloging threats and allies out of pure habit, when it happened. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a sight, it was a scent. Wildflowers and summer rain. It cut through the stifling air like a bolt of lightning, striking the core of his being. It was a scent that didn't belong here. It was a scent of memory, a scent of longing, a scent of home. The word bloomed in his mind, nonsensical and absolute. His glass trembled in his hand. The envoy's voice faded to nothing. The entire world narrowed to that single impossible scent, and the beast inside him broke its chains. For years he had kept his wolf on a leash of iron discipline. It was a tool, a weapon, an asset. But in that moment, it was a rampaging god. It rose up, roaring a single possessive word that echoed not in his ears, but in his very bones. Mine. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's focus. He was no longer a king. He was a hunter. He needed to find the source. He needed to claim it. He needed to understand why a simple scent could shatter a decade of control. And then he saw her, a serving girl, plainly dressed, head bowed. She was trying to slip away, to vanish back into the woodwork. He'd glanced at her a second before, one of a dozen servants, and had dismissed her entirely. But now her scent rolled off her in waves, a beacon in the dark. He had never seen her before in his life. He was sure of it. So why did his wolf howl her name? A name he didn't even know. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary primal sound that made the human envoy flinch and fall silent. Rowan didn't notice. He didn't care. His world had tilted on its axis. The man, the king, was screaming that this was madness, a trick of the mind, a hallucination. But the wolf knew better. The wolf remembered. My king. Kyle's voice was at his elbow, sharp with alarm. Rowan ignored him. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the girl. She was fleeing now, her movements panicked. Her terror was a scent too, sharp and sweet under the wildflowers, and it called to every protective instinct he possessed. Rowan, Kyle hissed, his hand daring to touch his arm. Rowan shook him off without a glance, the touch an unbearable annoyance. He had to get to her. He had to know. What was this sorcery? What was this feeling, this violent, clawing certainty that a piece of his own soul was in that room trying to run from him? He started moving, his long strides eating up the distance. People melted out of his way, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They saw the Alpha King, but for the first time in years they were seeing the wolf he held inside. And it was finally, terrifyingly free.
She ran. That's all she knew. Her feet flew over the polished marble floors, her breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical weight, a brand searing into her skin. She pushed through a set of ornate doors and found herself in a long, empty corridor lined with portraits of dead people. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, judging her. The hallway ended at another door, and she threw it open, stumbling out into the cold night air. A garden. Manicured hedges and stone benches, all bathed in the pale, indifferent light of the moon. Shadows danced between the rose bushes. She pressed herself into an alcove, her body trembling, her heart a wild bird trying to beat its way out of her ribcage. She didn't know what scared her more, that he had remembered her, or that he hadn't, and was still coming for her. Before she could move again, a large shadow fell over her. She looked up and he was there. He hadn't run. He had simply arrived. He blocked the moonlight, a towering silhouette of controlled power. "Who are you?" His voice was a low growl, not the voice from her memories, but something deeper, more dangerous. "No one," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm just a server. I made a mistake." He took a step closer, and the space between them burned. Her instincts surged, screaming at her to run, to hide, to fight. He was so close now she could smell him. Pine, winter air, and something uniquely masculine that her body remembered even if his mind didn't. "Don't lie to me," he snarled, his eyes glowing with an almost imperceptible golden light. "What did you do?" "Do?" she stammered, confused and terrified. "I didn't do anything." "The scent," he bit out, his jaw tight. "Why do you smell like my memories? Why do you smell like mine?" Her thoughts spun. He knows. A part of him, the wolf, knows. The realization didn't comfort her. It terrified her. This wasn't the gentle boy from that summer. This was a king, a predator. And he was looking at her as if she were a puzzle he was willing to tear apart to solve. She had to protect Leo. That one thought was a lighthouse in her storm of fear. He could never know. If this cold, hard king ever found out he had a son, a half-human son born in scandal, what would he do? Would he take him? Would he hide him away? Would he destroy him? With a single glance, her fear for herself evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard fury of a mother. It was a strength she didn't know she had. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're mistaken. Now please let me go." In the stillness that followed, she tried to push past him, but he moved with impossible speed, blocking her path. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. His sheer presence was a cage. Under the weight of his stare, something inside her shifted. "I am the king," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "And I do not make mistakes." Her world tilted. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was electric. Fire bloomed beneath her skin, a shock that jolted through her every nerve. And in his eyes, for a fraction of a second, she saw not the king but the boy, lost, confused, aching for something he couldn't name. In that single heartbeat, the world shifted. The tension broke. She saw her chance. She shoved past him, his momentary distraction giving her the opening she needed. And she ran. She ran through the gardens, her feet slipping on the damp stone, not daring to look back, the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. She didn't stop until the iron gates of the estate were far behind her, and all she could hear was the frantic, desperate pounding of her own heart. She had escaped. But as she fled back to the only home she had, she knew with a chilling certainty that this was not an ending. It was just the beginning. Panic was a poison, seeping into her blood, hot and fast. The moment she slammed the door to her tiny apartment, the lock clicking shut felt like a joke, a paper shield against a tidal wave. Her world had been a fragile thing, a tiny, cracked teacup she held with both hands, and he had shattered it with a single glance. She had to get Leo. She had to run. But then, where would they go? She had no money, no allies, and now a king's strange, obsessive fury was aimed squarely at her. Without thinking, her body moved, a frantic machine of pure terror. She threw a worn canvas bag onto the bed. Clothes for Leo. His favorite stuffed bear, its button eyes staring up at her. A handful of her own things. The room was a blur. Her thoughts spun, a whirlwind of impossible choices. Deep down, she knew the truth. There was nowhere on this earth she could run where an alpha king couldn't find her. But she had to try. For Leo. That's why, when the knock came, it wasn't a surprise. It was an execution. A solid, heavy knock on the thin wood of her door. Thump, thump, thump. Not loud, not angry. It was worse. It was patient. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her hand hovering over a stack of Leo's drawings. Maybe if she was quiet, they would leave. A fool's hope, and she knew it. In the other room, Leo stirred, his sleepy voice a dagger in her heart. "Mommy?" Before she could answer, the knock came again. This time, a voice followed, calm and clear. "Arya Kalin, we know you are in there. By order of the king, you are to come with us." Without warning, the fight drained out of her, leaving a hollow, aching dread. By order of the king. There was no arguing with that. There was no running. The game was over before it had even begun. With trembling hands, she walked to the door and opened it. Two men stood in the dingy hallway. They were massive, dressed in dark, formal uniforms with the snarling head of a wolf embroidered in silver on the collars. They weren't thugs. They were soldiers. Their faces were stone, their eyes missing any hint of pity. My son," she stammered, her voice a broken whisper. The taller of the two guards gave a slight formal nod. "The boy is to come as well. The king's orders were explicit. You will both be treated as his honored guests." Guests. The word was a mockery, a lie. She knew what she was, a prisoner, a curiosity. The journey was a silent, waking nightmare. They were placed in a dark, unmarked carriage that rode with impossible smoothness, and as it climbed higher and higher into the mountains, leaving the dreary familiarity of Havenwood behind, Arya held Leo tight against her. He was confused, but not scared. Not yet. "Are they knights, Mommy?" he whispered, his eyes wide as he peered at the stoic guards. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Something like that, baby." And then, she saw it. The Sunstone Citadel. It wasn't a castle, it was a wound in the side of the mountain, a fortress of black, jagged stone that clawed at the sky. It looked like it had been built by angry gods, a place of power and fury. As they passed through the massive gates, she felt them slam shut behind her, not just on the road, but on her entire life. This place wasn't a home. It was a tomb. She expected a dungeon, a cell. Instead, they were led through vast, echoing halls to a set of heavy oak doors. Inside was a paradise, a suite of rooms larger than her entire apartment. A fire roared in a stone hearth. The bed was piled high with furs and silk pillows. A plate of fruit and cheese sat on a low table. It was the most beautiful cage she had ever seen. Moments later, after the guards left, their footsteps receding down the hall, Leo ran to the window. "Mommy, look! We're in the clouds!" Arya walked over, her legs feeling like lead, and looked out. They were so high up that the tops of the pine trees were a green carpet far below. There was no way out. With every heartbeat, her fear began to cool, hardening into something else. Something solid. A resolve made of pure, uncut maternal rage. They had taken her. They had trapped her. They had brought her son into this dangerous, predatory world. She didn't know what the king wanted from her, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would die before she let him harm her son. A sharp rap on the door made her jump. An older woman entered, her face severe, her dress immaculate. She didn't smile. "The king will see you now," the woman said, her voice as cold and hard as the citadel's stone walls. The time for running was over. Now she had to face the beast.
Control was a memory. A pleasant fiction he had told himself for years. In the aftermath of the summit, Rowan stood in his private study, the fire doing little to warm the icy fury in his veins. He stared into the flames, but all he saw were her eyes, terrified, defiant, familiar. The scent of her, wild flowers and rain, still clung to his senses, a phantom touch that drove his wolf into a frenzy. It paced the edges of his consciousness, a caged predator snarling a constant, maddening refrain. Mine. Find her. Keep her. This was not desire. This was possession. A madness that had stripped away the king and left only the beast, and it had made him act with a recklessness that was already having consequences. The heavy doors to his study opened, and Lord Kale entered, followed by 2 other senior members of the council. Their faces were grim masks of disapproval. They did not wait to be summoned. A calculated insult. A test. "My king," Kale began, his voice dangerously smooth. "An explanation is required. You abandoned a diplomatic envoy. You caused a scene. And now we have word that you have brought a low-born human girl, a commoner, and her child, into the Sunstone Citadel, into these sacred halls." Rowan turned from the fire, letting the silence stretch. He let them see the cold fury in his eyes, the utter lack of regret. He was the alpha. They would remember that. "I am the king," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My actions require no explanation." "They do," another elder Lorien dared to say. "When they threaten the sanctity of our laws and the stability of our kingdom, she is unranked, unclaimed. To bring her here, it is a stain." "She is a person of interest," Rowan lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "in a matter of internal security." Kale's lips thinned into a bloodless line. He did not believe it for a second. A security matter that required you to hunt her down like a stray? That required you to abandon your duties? He took a step forward, his voice dropping, laced with false concern. "Rowan, the council is worried. This obsession, it is not like you. It is a weakness. Your enemies will see it. Our allies, like the Silvermoon Pack, will see it. Lady Seraphina deserves better than to have her betrothal treated as an afterthought." Every word was a carefully placed dagger. Duty. Betrothal. Weakness. They were trying to cage him with the words he had always lived by. But the wolf no longer cared for cages. "Lady Seraphina's honor is not in question," Rowan snarled, taking a step toward them, his sheer presence forcing them back. The air thickened, charged with his power. "But my authority is, you come into my private study. You question my orders. You speak to me of weakness." His eyes glowed, the gold bleeding into the brown. "The girl stays. She will answer my questions. That is my will. And my will is law." In the quiet that followed, the challenge hung in the air, sharp and clear. This was no longer about a girl. This was about who truly ruled the kingdom, the king or his council. Kale was the first to break, bowing his head in a show of submission that fooled no one. "Of course, my king. Forgive our concern. We live only to serve." "See that you remember that," Rowan said, his voice dropping to ice. "Now leave me." They backed out of the room, their retreat a mixture of fear and simmering resentment. He had won this battle. But as the doors closed, leaving him alone in the firelight, he knew the war had just begun. He had defied his council. He had alienated his allies. He had staked his entire authority on a lie, all for a girl whose name he didn't even know, a girl whose scent felt more real to him than his own crown. He stared at the heavy door that led to the guest suites where she was being held. He had created this storm, and now he was in the eye of it. His wolf pressed forward, its voice a dark whisper in his soul. "She has the answers." As if the forest watched, he knew Kale and the others would not remain idle. They would move against him, against her. He was running out of time. Without another word to the empty room, he strode towards the door. The king had failed to get answers through politics and reason. Now the beast would have its turn.
The king came for her not with a roar, but with a chilling, predatory silence. He entered her gilded cage without a word, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind him with a sound of finality, like a coffin lid closing. He didn't look at her, not at first. Instead, he prowled the length of the room, his movements fluid and dangerous, a panther in a space far too small for him. He trailed his fingers over the back of a silk chair, his gaze sweeping over every detail, as if seeing it all for the first time. She stood frozen by the hearth, Leo playing quietly at her feet with a set of carved wooden animals she'd found on a shelf. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the confrontation. Her one goal was a silent, desperate prayer. Don't let him see you're afraid. Don't let him see Leo is your only weakness. Finally, he stopped and turned to her, his eyes, dark, intense, and holding a sliver of gold that seemed to burn, pinned her in place. You ran. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a sin she had committed. I was scared, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Of me? He asked, and there was a strange, almost curious note in his voice. She swallowed. Yes, of what you are, of what you were, of what you've forgotten. But she said none of that. Instead, she lifted her chin. I don't belong here. A humorless smile touched his lips. On that, we agree. He took a step closer, and the air crackled. Leo stopped playing, his head tilting as he watched the giant, imposing man with wide, innocent eyes. But you are here now, so you will answer my questions. What is your name? Arya. The name felt foreign on her own tongue. Arya, he repeated, tasting the word. It didn't seem to mean anything to him. The hope she hadn't even known she was holding died. Why does my wolf know you, Arya? Why does your scent feel like a memory I can't grasp? She shook her head, her hands balling into fists at her sides. I told you. I don't know what you're talking about. In that moment, a growl rumbled in his chest, so low it was more a vibration than a sound. It was not human. It was the sound of a beast straining against its leash, and it made her blood run cold. Every instinct I have tells me you are lying. My wolf wants to tear this citadel apart to get to the truth. He took another step. He was so close now, close enough to touch. But the king must be more patient. His eyes narrowed. But my patience has its limits. As the silence stretched, she saw the war inside him, the raw primal instinct fighting against the cold logical ruler. And for the first time, she realized he wasn't pretending. He truly didn't know. The blankness in his eyes was real. He was a man haunted by a ghost, and he thought she was the ghost. The thought didn't make her feel safer. It made her feel worse. Because a man at war with himself was the most unpredictable creature of all. Later that day, she convinced a stern-faced guard to let her take Leo to a small walled courtyard for fresh air. She needed to escape the suffocating luxury of her rooms. As Leo chased a butterfly near a stone bench, Arya heard voices from an adjoining walkway above, low and venomous. A distraction the king cannot afford, a harsh voice said. It was one of the men who had been with Lord Kale in Rowan's study. Kale is handling it, another voice replied. The longer she stays, the more she weakens him. The Silver Moon Pack will not tolerate this insult. We must remove the taint before it sets in. Taint. The word struck her like a physical blow. They weren't talking about her like a person. They were talking about her like a disease, like a poison that needed to be purged. Her fear, which had been a wild, frantic thing, suddenly cooled and sharpened into a razor's edge. Her goal was no longer just to escape him. She had to protect her son from them. Without thinking, she swept Leo up into her arms, holding him tight against her chest, as if she could physically shield him from their hatred. Her eyes scanned the cold stone walls of her new prison, and she knew. She wasn't just a captive, she was a target.
Frustration was a bitter metallic taste in his mouth. His confrontation with the girl, Arya, had yielded nothing. Less than nothing. She had stood before him, a fragile thing of stubborn defiance, and lied to his face. He knew she was lying. His wolf knew. But the king had no proof. And her fear, Her fear had been tangled with something else, a resolve so fierce it had taken him by surprise. It was the resolve of a she-wolf protecting a cub. He now stood on a high balcony overlooking that same courtyard, a shadow among shadows. He was watching her. He told himself it was tactical, to observe, to find a weakness in her defenses. But the truth was, he couldn't look away. Down below, she was pushing the boy, Leo, on a small wrought iron swing. The afternoon sun caught in her hair, turning it to fire, and she was smiling. Not the brittle, forced smile from the diner, or the terrified grimace from the hallway. This was a real smile. It was soft and unguarded, and it transformed her face, chasing the shadows from her eyes. It was a smile of pure, unconditional love. He watched as she laughed, a sound too distant for him to truly hear, but he could see the shape of it on her lips. And as he watched, something broke. The world fractured. For a single, blinding second, the stone balcony beneath his hands vanished. He smelled it first. The overwhelming, intoxicating scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut grass, so strong it was like he had his face buried in them. Then, a feeling, the phantom sensation of cool, soft earth under his palms. A sound followed, a ghost of a memory, an echo in his soul. Laughter, her laughter. But not the gentle smile he was seeing now. This was a free, joyful, unrestrained sound that vibrated with a happiness he couldn't remember ever feeling himself. And then, a flash of an image, blurry and indistinct behind his eyes. A canopy of stars, a moon so bright it hurt to look at, and her face, tilted up towards his, her eyes sparkling with a light he had never seen before, and never seen since. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted back into focus. He was on the balcony. The air was cold. The girl was still below, pushing her son on the swing. But everything had changed. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his head, a gasp tearing from his lungs. It wasn't just the wolf anymore. It wasn't just a scent. It was a memory, a piece of one, a fragment of a feeling so powerful, so real, that it left him shaking. It was his memory, his feeling. And it was connected to her. The carefully constructed walls around the gaping hole in his past crumbled to dust. The lies he'd been told, the reassurances from his counsel that it was just a skirmish, just a blow to the head, they were all exposed for the shabby deceptions they were. They hadn't just hidden an enemy attack from him. They had hidden her. They had stolen a piece of his life. The confusion he'd been battling for days was burned away, replaced by a cold, white-hot certainty that was more terrifying than any madness. His obsession was not an obsession. It was a haunting. His goal, in that instant, transformed. It was no longer about understanding a strange connection. It was about reclaiming a stolen past. It was about uncovering a betrayal that went to the very heart of his throne, his counsel, and his own mind. His eyes locked on her again, no longer with confusion, but with a new, terrifying focus. She wasn't just a puzzle. She was the key. As fire bloomed beneath his skin, he turned from the balcony. His steps were no longer the measured tread of a king, but the silent, purposeful stalk of a predator who has finally caught the scent of his true prey. And this time the prey wasn't her. It was the liars who surrounded him.
The air in the courtyard had gone still. One moment she was pushing Leo on the swing, the rhythmic creak of the chains a small, peaceful sound in the vast silence of the citadel. The next, a shadow fell over them, and the world went cold. She looked up, and he was there. Rowan. But he was different. The cold fury was gone. The predatory intensity was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that was 1,000 times more terrifying. His face was pale, his eyes wide and haunted as if he'd just seen a ghost. "It was you," he breathed, his voice rough, broken, in the field of wildflowers, under the stars. Her blood turned to ice. She instinctively pulled Leo behind her, shielding him with her body. I don't... Stop lying. he choked out, and the sound was so full of pain it made her chest ache. He took a step closer, his hands held up as if to show he meant no harm. I don't remember, not all of it, but I feel it. Your laugh. I can almost hear it. It was real, wasn't it? That night was real. She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This changed everything. He wasn't just a cold king anymore. He was a man who had been wounded, who had been robbed, a man who was staring at her as if she were the only thing that could make him whole again. The lie she had been holding on to, her shield of denial, it suddenly felt cruel. Between them, something cracked. What did they do to me? He whispered, his kingly authority stripped away, leaving only a lost, desperate man. What was taken from me? The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. She could see the path before her. She could tell him everything. Tell him about the boy from that summer who was so full of life and laughter. Tell him about the promises he'd whispered. Tell him about the child he had unknowingly fathered. She could give him the weapon he needed to fight his counsel. But that weapon was her son. What would this broken, powerful man do with that truth? Could she trust him to protect Leo, or would he see him only as a pawn in his own dangerous game? Her own survival no longer mattered, only Leo's. In the stillness that followed, she made a choice. Not the whole truth. But not a lie either. A first step, a terrifying, dangerous gamble. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine from the forests below, she finally met his desperate gaze. Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. We met before, she said, each word a stone dropping into a deep, silent well. On the night you say you can't remember.
Her words were not a confession. They were a key. On the night you say you can't remember. The phrase echoed in the silence of his mind, unlocking doors he never knew existed. Rowan stood in his study, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, but he saw nothing. He saw only her face in the courtyard, terrified, brave, and telling a truth that was wrapped in 1,000 lies. The memory fragment hadn't been a phantom. It was an anchor, a single, solid point in the swirling chaos of his stolen past. Because of that, the king who had been content to wait, to be patient, died. In his place, the wolf and the man merged, forged into a single deadly weapon with one purpose: to hunt. Not for the girl, but for the truth. And he knew his first target. Moments later, he was striding through the great hall, his boots echoing like hammer blows on the flagstones. The guards and attendants who saw him coming melted away, their heads bowed, their scents thick with fear. They didn't see their king. They saw the alpha, raw and untamed, his power rolling off him in palpable waves. He found Lord Cale in the council chambers, reviewing strategic maps with 2 other elders. The moment Rowan entered, the air went cold. "My king," Cale began, his voice smooth as polished stone, but his eyes were wary. "An unexpected." "The meeting with the Silvermoon delegation," Rowan cut him off, his voice flat, devoid of all warmth. "It is postponed. Indefinitely." The silence that followed was a physical shock. One of the elders actually gasped. To postpone such a meeting was more than an insult. It was a political earthquake. It was a rejection of the alliance, a rejection of Lady Seraphina. Cale's face remained a perfect, placid mask, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. "May I ask, why?" "You may not," Rowan said, taking a slow step into the room. The scent of their shock was a heady perfume. He let them feel the full weight of his authority, a crushing pressure. He was not asking. He was not negotiating. He was declaring war. "You will send a raven to Lord Valerius. Inform him that a matter of internal security requires my complete attention. That is all." He had thrown the first stone. He had publicly and deliberately defied their most cherished plan, all because of the ghost of a memory. He had chosen the unknown girl over the powerful high-born she-wolf, and he wanted them to know it. Before either could speak, he turned and left, the swirl of his cloak a final, dismissive gesture. He felt their eyes on his back, burning with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Good. Let them burn. But he wasn't finished. Instead of returning to his study, he descended into the lower levels of the citadel, to the barracks of the Royal Guard. He sought out one man and one man only. Fenrir. An older wolf, his face a roadmap of scars, his loyalty to Rowan absolute and unquestioned, since the day Rowan had saved his life in a border skirmish years ago. He found him sharpening a blade in the dim light of the armory. Fenrir, Rowan said, his voice low. The older wolf was on his feet in an instant, his head bowed. My king. The official records of my accident, Rowan began, the word tasting foul. The border incident all those years ago, they are sealed in the archives. Fenrir nodded, his eyes sharp, questioning. Aye, by council order. I want the real records. Rowan Grow gas pedal. Not the official report. I want the guard logs, the healer's initial findings, the patrol reports from that night. Everything they buried. Find them. Bring them to me. And Fenrir. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. No one knows. Not Kale. Not the council. Not another soul. If they find out, they will stop you. And I cannot protect you if you are discovered. The old wolf's eyes gleamed in the torchlight. He understood the risk. This was not an order. This was a suicide mission. But there was no fear in his scent. Only unwavering loyalty. It will be done, my king. As he left the armory, Rowan felt the first stirrings of something that wasn't just rage. It was a cold, clear purpose. He had committed to a path from which there was no retreat. He had gambled his throne, his betrothal, and his most loyal soldier's life on the word of a frightened girl and the echo of a forgotten laugh. And he would burn their entire world down to prove he was right. The citadel was buzzing. A hornet's nest kicked by its own king. From his chambers, Rowan could feel the ripple effects of his decisions. The fear, the confusion, the whispers in the halls. He had shattered the illusion of stability, and he had done it on purpose. Let them whisper. Let them fear. Fear made people careless. At the same time, in another wing of the fortress, Lord Kale stood before a crackling fire, his hands clasped behind his back. He was not afraid. He was not confused. He was disappointed. He had groomed Rowan since he was a pup. He had molded him into a king, taught him the hard lessons of duty, sacrifice, and control. He had orchestrated the lie about that night to protect the boy, to protect the throne from a moment of youthful, reckless folly. And now, it was all unraveling. All because of a common girl with a familiar scent. The king was no longer playing by the rules. The pressure of politics, the weight of duty, none of it was working. Rowan was acting on instinct. He was acting like a beast. And Kale knew, with a chilling certainty, that you could not reason with a beast. You had to cage it, or you had to break its heart. He knew what Rowan had ordered Fenrir to do. The old wolf was loyal, but the walls of the citadel had ears, and most of those ears belonged to Kale. The king was digging for a past Kale had buried for a reason, and he would get there eventually, which meant Kale's timeline had just moved up. He had to end this. Now. So he would use a different weapon, not politics, not lies. He would use tradition. He would use the sacred ancient laws of the pack, laws even a king could not easily defy without looking like a tyrant. He walked over to a heavy, carved desk and pulled a cord for an attendant. Moments later, a young man appeared, his head bowed low. Yes, my lord. The guests, Kale said, his voice smooth as silk. The woman and her child. There is an old custom, one we have not observed in some time, but a custom nonetheless. All children residing within the royal wing who have not been presented to the pack must undergo a wellness and bloodline assessment with the elder healers. The attendant blinked, confused. My lord, I am not familiar with... It is an old law, Kale said, his voice hardening just enough to cut off any further questions. From a time when our bloodlines were more precarious. It ensures the health and purity of any child residing so close to the alpha. A formality, but a necessary one. You will go to the woman's chambers. You will inform her of this tradition, and you will escort the boy to the healer's wing. He paused, letting his words sink in. He saw the flicker of understanding and fear in the young man's eyes. He knew exactly what this was, an abduction sanctioned by law. She may resist, Kyle added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She is human, after all. She does not understand our ways. You will be polite. You will be respectful. But you will not fail. The law is the law. He held the attendant's gaze, his own eyes like chips of ice. Is that understood? Yes, my lord, the attendant breathed. As the young man scurried away, Kyle turned back to the fire. He felt no remorse, no guilt. He was saving his king. He was saving his kingdom. This girl, this Arya, was a poison, a weakness that would bring them all to ruin. He would prove it. He would isolate her, break her, and then use her own child as leverage to force her to confess to being a spy, a witch, whatever was necessary. Rowan, faced with such a betrayal, would have no choice but to cast her out. His heart would break, yes, but it would heal, and the kingdom would be safe. He had lit a fire, a terrible, painful, but necessary fire, and she was the one who was about to be burned.
Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. In the hours after her confrontation with Rowan, Arya had felt it bloom in her chest, a tiny, tentative flower in the dead of winter. He had a memory, a fragment. He knew something was wrong. Maybe she hadn't made a mistake. Maybe there was a path through this nightmare that didn't end in ruin for her and Leo. She was sitting with her son on the thick fur rug before the fire, helping him stack wooden blocks into a wobbly tower. For a moment, it was almost peaceful. The fire was warm. Leo's laughter was bright. If she didn't look out the window at the endless sky, she could almost pretend they were safe. That's when the knock came. Her entire body went rigid. Her hand, hovering over a block, started to tremble. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative knock of the guards. This was lighter, sharper. She stood slowly and opened the door. It wasn't Rowan. It was two attendants, a man and a woman, their faces polite, impersonal masks. The same woman from before stood with them. "Good afternoon," the woman said, her voice crisp and cool. "We are here for the boy." Arya's blood turned to ice. "What?" "There is a custom," the woman explained, her tone leaving no room for argument. "An old one. All children residing in the royal wing must be presented to our healers for a wellness and bloodline assessment. It is a formality." Bloodline assessment. The words echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of her mind. Her hand instinctively went to Leo, pulling him behind her skirt. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "He's fine. He doesn't need to see any healers." "It is not a request," the male attendant said, his voice still polite but with an undercurrent of steel. "It is the law of the Citadel." Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. This wasn't Rowan. She knew it. This was a move from the shadows. This was the council. This was them. "I will not let you take him," she said, her voice rising. Without warning, the female attendant stepped forward with surprising speed. She knelt down, her face softening into a false, sweet smile as she looked at Leo. "Hello, little one. We are just going to play a fun game with the doctors. It won't take long at all. Your mother will be right here when you get back." "No!" Arya cried, trying to pull Leo away. But it was too late. The male attendant stepped in front of her, a human wall, blocking her path. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an impassable barrier. The female attendant took Leo's hand, and he looked back at Arya, his small face a mask of confusion and burgeoning fear. "Mommy?" Her heart shattered. "Don't you touch him!" she screamed, shoving against the attendant's chest, but it was like hitting a stone wall. They were already leading him out the door. Her son, her world, her reason for breathing. They were taking him. The moment the door clicked shut, her strength gave out. A scream tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony and terror. She pounded on the wood until her fists were numb, her cries echoing in the opulent, empty room. They had him. They had taken her son. In that single, horrific moment, the fragile flower of hope in her chest was ripped out by the roots. The fear, the confusion, the despair, it all burned away, incinerated by a single, towering emotion that was as pure and absolute as the sun. Rage. Her tears stopped. Her breathing evened. She stood up, her back straight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The point of no return had just been crossed. This was no longer about a forgotten past or a possible future. This was not about kings and councils. This was about her child. She walked to the door, her steps steady and silent. She didn't know who she was going to have to kill to get him back. But she was going to start with the king. Rage was a river of fire in her veins. It burned away the fear, it burned away the tears. She stormed through the cold, echoing corridors of the citadel. A woman possessed. She didn't know the way, not really. But her body moved with a purpose that was as pure and deadly as a drawn blade. She was going to find the king. She was going to stand before him, and he was either going to give her back her son, or she was going to tear the truth from his throat with her bare hands. The guards she passed saw the look in her eyes and simply stepped aside. They saw the she-wolf, and they knew better than to get in her way. But then, as she rounded a corner into a vast, tapestry-lined hall, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. It wasn't Rowan. It was the old one, Lord Kale. He stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, a small, knowing smile on his lips. He was a wall of calm, smiling cruelty. "Such a hurry, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as polished glass. "One might think you were distressed." "Where is he?" she bit out, her voice a low snarl. "Where is my son?" Kyle's smile didn't falter. "The boy is perfectly safe. He is with our finest healers. They are finding him. Quite remarkable." He let the words hang in the air, a veiled threat. "He will be returned to you, and you both will be free to leave this place, to go wherever you wish, with a purse heavy enough to ensure you never want for anything again." Arya stared at him, suspicion and confusion warring with the fire in her gut. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about a deal," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step towards her. The scent of him was dry and old, like dust and forgotten books. "A simple arrangement. Your son's freedom. For a small service." She didn't know what scared her more, his words, or the utter lack of emotion in his eyes. "What service?" His smile widened, and it was a terrible, predatory thing. "A confession." He saw the confusion on her face and savored it. "You will stand before the king and the assembly this evening, and you will confess to being a spy for the southern territories. You will tell them you were sent here to bewitch the king with your human wiles, to use your unique scent, to cloud his judgment and destabilize his reign. You will confess to this treason, and in return for your honesty, the king will show you mercy. He will banish you, and you and your son will be free." The world tilted. The rage that had been her armor, her weapon, it just evaporated, leaving her hollowed out and cold. He wasn't just trying to get rid of her, he was trying to erase her, to turn her into a monster, to poison any memory Rowan might ever have of her. "No," she breathed, the words stolen from her lungs. "Oh, yes," Kyle said softly. "You see, the king is unwell. This obsession with you is a sickness, and you, my dear, are the cure." He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Think of it. If you refuse, the boy stays. He will be raised as a ward of the citadel, a half-blood cur with a traitor for a mother. He will never know a moment's peace. Is that what you want for him?" Her breath caught, a raw, ragged sob. The choice was not a choice, it was a checkmate. Her son's life, for her soul. Her knees felt weak. The fire was gone. In its place was an endless, desolate winter. Her own father's words came back to her, a cruel ghost from the past. "You are unworthy. You bring ruin wherever you go." Maybe he was right. Maybe Cale was right. Maybe she really was a poison. Before the words left her lips, she knew she had already lost. "You have until the evening assembly to decide," Cale said, straightening up, his work done. He gave her a small, almost pitying look. "I do hope you make the wise choice, for the boy's sake." He walked away, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall, leaving her alone in the crushing, absolute silence. She had come seeking a king to face her rage. Instead, she had found a monster who had stolen her hope.
Patience was a thread, and his was worn down to a single, frayed strand. He paced his study like a caged wolf, the fire having long since burned down to sullen, glowing embers. The scent of Arya's fear and Kyle's smug ambition still clung to the air in the citadel, a foul combination that set his teeth on edge. He was waiting for Fenrir, waiting for the truth. But then, the doors to his study opened, and it was not Fenrir who entered. It was Cale, Lorien, and 2 other elders from the council. They moved not with deference, but with the grim, righteous purpose of executioners. "This has gone on long enough, Rowan," Cale said, his voice hard, stripped of its usual courtesy. Rowan turned on him, a snarl rising in his throat. "You dare come to me?" "We dare to save our kingdom from its king," Lorien shot back, his face flushed with anger. He threw a leather portfolio onto the large oak table. It landed with a heavy final thud. "We have proof." Rowan stared at the portfolio, then back at their stony faces. A cold dread, heavy and unwelcome, began to seep into his veins. "Proof of what?" "Of her treason," Cale said, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "We did not want to believe it. We investigated the girl, as is our duty, to ensure she was not a threat. We had hoped to find nothing." He opened the portfolio. "To our great regret, we found everything." He slid a piece of parchment across the polished wood. A letter. The handwriting was a delicate, feminine script. Rowan's blood ran cold. He had seen that script before, on the lists of supplies she had requested for her rooms. It was hers. He picked it up. The letter was addressed to a supposed contact in the South, detailing his routines, his moods, the political tensions with the Silvermoon Pack. It spoke of a potion of scent used to ensnare the beast's mind. It was a lie. It was all a lie. But it was in her handwriting. "A forgery," Rowan growled, his voice a strained whisper. "Is it?" Cale asked softly. He pushed another stack of papers forward. Witness statements from her hometown, from people who saw her meeting with a southern trader, a known spy, just weeks before the summit. They were paid, of course, to provide these statements. She is quite resourceful. He felt the floor shift beneath his feet. The logical, rational part of his mind, the king, was reeling. The evidence was compelling. It was a neat, tidy narrative that explained everything. His madness, his obsession. It wasn't a memory. It was an enchantment. It wasn't fate. It was treason. But his wolf was howling, screaming, clawing at the inside of his skull. Lies, trap, lies. "No," he said, shaking his head, trying to clear the fog. "Her scent. My wolf." "Your wolf is compromised," Lorien insisted. "She has somehow targeted the beast within you, bypassing the man. Can't you see? It is the perfect attack. To turn our greatest strength, the Alpha's instinct, into a fatal weakness." They were using his own logic, his own fears, against him. They had crafted the perfect cage, and he was walking right into it. The war inside him exploded. The king saw the proof, the logic, the danger to his people. The wolf smelled only its mate. He looked at the letter again, at the damning, elegant curves of her writing. He looked at the sworn statements. He looked at the cold, certain faces of his council. And for the first time, he didn't know which part of himself to believe. The thread of his patience snapped. He was utterly, completely alone, trapped between a treasonous mind and a traitorous heart.
She didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of her. She sat on the edge of the ridiculously luxurious bed in her gilded cage, the silence a-roaring in her ears. She was a ghost in a life that wasn't hers, a pawn in a game she had never agreed to play. Lord Kale's words played over and over in her mind. Taint, sickness, weakness. They echoed her father's parting words, a cruel chorus across the years. You bring ruin. And maybe they were right. Before she had reappeared, Rowan was a king. A cold, hard man, yes, but a respected one. Now, the citadel was in chaos. He was at war with his own council. His betrothal was in jeopardy. And it was all because of her. Because of a single forgotten night. To make things worse, she couldn't get the image of Leo's face out of her mind. His confusion. His fear. She had brought him into this. Her mistake, years ago, had led him here, to this beautiful, terrible prison where he was being used as a weapon against his own mother. Her deepest flaw, the one she had fought against for 5 long years, rose up and swallowed her whole. The belief that she was unworthy, that she was a mistake, that her only purpose was to be a cautionary tale. It wasn't a fear anymore. In the cold, quiet despair of this room, it felt like the truth. The fight was over. How could she fight a truth that lived in her own bones? She had wanted to stand before Rowan and demand justice. But what right did she have? What was her word against that of a powerful lord? She was nothing. A disgraced girl from a dreary town with a child born of shame. But her son was everything. He was innocent. He deserved a life, even if it was a life without her. Even if it meant he would grow up thinking his mother was a monster. At least he would grow up. He would be safe. In the quiet that followed, her decision settled over her not like a storm, but like a soft, suffocating blanket of snow. There was no rage left, no hope, no fight. There was only the cold, hard calculus of a mother's love. Her life, her name, her honor. They were all meaningless next to his safety. She would become the villain of his story to ensure he had a story at all. She walked over to the heavy oak door, her movements slow, detached, as if she were watching someone else. She knocked once. When a guard appeared, his face impassive, she did not look at him. She stared at a point on the stone wall behind him, her voice a hollow, empty thing. "Tell Lord Kale," she began, her own voice sounding strange and distant in her ears. She took a breath that didn't feel like it filled her lungs. "I'll do it." The king was a fool, and the wolf was a prisoner in his foolish mind. Rowan stood in the dead silence of his study, the forged letters spread across the table like a funeral shroud. The council's words echoed in his skull, a logical, reasonable poison. "She is a spy. She bewitched you. This is proof." Every piece of evidence was a bar in a cage being built around his heart. His mind, the logical, kingly mind he had trusted his entire life, was screaming at him to accept it, to cut out the poison, to save his kingdom. But then, a messenger arrived, a single, deferential bow. "My king, a message from Lord Kale. The girl. She has agreed to confess." The words should have been a relief. A bitter, painful confirmation, but a relief nonetheless. The end of the madness. The proof he needed to finally silence the howling beast inside him. Instead, a wave of revulsion so violent it nearly brought him to his knees crashed over him. It felt wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. Like the sun rising in the west. His wolf, which had been pacing and snarling, threw itself against the bars of its cage in a silent, screaming fury. Trap! Mate! Lies! Leave me, he snarled at the messenger, his voice a choked growl. The moment the door shut, he slammed his fist onto the table, the wood groaning in protest. Why would she confess if it were a lie? The kingly part of his mind supplied the answer. Because she was caught. But the wolf offered another. Because she is protecting something. He began to pace, the room a cage too small for his torment. He caught his reflection in the dark, polished surface of a shield hanging on the wall. A king's face, a tormented face. But as he stared, another face flashed in his mind's eye, unbidden and crystal clear. Leo. The boy. He saw the child's face from the courtyard. He saw his wide, curious eyes. He saw the shape of his mouth. He saw his own. He saw the eyes of his father and his father before him, staring back at him from a child's face. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a scent. It wasn't an instinct. It was a truth as solid and real as the stone beneath his feet. A truth that shattered every lie, every piece of evidence, every logical conclusion. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The war inside him was over. The man and the wolf, the king and the beast, they finally, violently slammed together into one being, united by a single incandescent thought. He is my son. A roar of pure, untamed rage tore from his throat. Not a sound of a man, but the sound of an alpha who has just realized his heir has been threatened. The cage was gone. Kale hadn't just lied to him. He hadn't just tried to steal his mate. He had used his son as a weapon against them. The cold dread vanished, incinerated by a fury so absolute it was almost calm. He knew exactly what he had to do. His goal was no longer to find the truth. His goal was to reclaim his family. He strode to the door, his movements no longer conflicted but filled with a deadly, terrible purpose. The assembly was waiting for a confession. Let them wait. He was going to his queen. She was waiting for the end. Numb. That's all she felt. She sat on the floor of her chambers, her arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the silence. It was the silence of surrender. The silence of a life already over. Soon, they would come for her. They would lead her to the assembly hall like a lamb to the slaughter, and she would say the words that would destroy her life to save her sons. She felt nothing. No fear. No anger. Just a vast, empty wasteland where her heart used to be. But then the door to her chambers didn't just open. It exploded inward, slamming against the stone wall with a crack like thunder. And he was there. Rowan. But this was a Rowan she had never seen before. Not the cold king, not the confused man. His eyes were pure gold, blazing with a fire that seemed to light the room. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, and he looked at her not with accusation, but with a wild, desperate, agonizing fire that stole the air from her lungs. She scrambled to her feet, her numbness shattered by a jolt of pure shock. He stalked towards her, crossing the vast room in 3 long strides. He stopped just before her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body thrumming with a power that was both terrifying and beautiful. "They told me you confessed," he breathed, his voice a raw, ragged thing. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, her throat tight. "You're a terrible liar," he whispered, and his voice cracked with an emotion she couldn't name. It sounded like agony. It sounded like hope. Before she could process what was happening, he dropped to one knee before her. A king, on his knees. He looked up at her, his golden eyes pleading, searching. "He's mine, isn't he?" The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. "What?" "Leo," he said, his voice breaking. "Our son. He's mine." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A truth he had somehow clawed his way to, through all the lies, through his own broken memory. In that moment, the dam inside her broke. The despair, the fear, the rage, the tiny, stubborn spark of love she had tried to extinguish for 5 long years. It all came rushing out in a single, gut-wrenching sob. "Yes," she cried, the word tearing from her soul. "Yes, he's yours." The relief that washed over his face was the most painful, beautiful thing she had ever seen. He surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. His embrace wasn't gentle. It was desperate, possessive. It was the embrace of a man who had found the missing piece of his soul. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel him shaking. And then, the whole story came pouring out of her. The summer night, the wildflowers, his laughter, the way he vanished, her parents' rejection, her lonely, desperate years in Havenwood. Everything. She told him everything. He listened, holding her tight, and with every word she spoke, she could feel the cold, hard shell of the king cracking, and the warm, passionate man she remembered from that summer night emerging from the ruins. When she was finished, he pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face. "They will pay for this," he growled, his golden eyes blazing with a promise of retribution. "Kale, the council, all of them, for what they did to you, for what they took from us." Her hope, which she had thought was dead and buried, flared to life, fierce and bright. "What do we do?" she whispered. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a predator who was finished being caged. "Kale wants a confession at the assembly," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "He wants a spectacle." He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, the world narrowing to just the two of them. "Then we will give him one." They walked through the halls of the Citadel, not as king and prisoner, but as partners, a storm front gathering force. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with 5 years of unspoken words, with the weight of a shared secret, and with the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of a battle about to be joined. Arya walked beside him, her head held high. For the first time since she'd entered this fortress, she did not feel like a captive. She felt powerful. His presence was a shield, and her truth was a sword. The guards and attendants they passed stared, their faces masks of shock and confusion. They saw their king, the cold, distant alpha, walking with the disgraced human girl. But they were not walking apart. His hand was resting on the small of her back, a simple, possessive gesture that was a declaration to the entire world. "She is with me." As they approached the massive carved doors of the great hall, he paused, turning to her. The sounds of the shuffling, murmuring crowd within were a low hum, the sound of the waiting arena. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his golden eyes searching hers. She took a deep breath, the cold mountain air filling her lungs. "Yes," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm not alone anymore." He lifted a hand and gently brushed a thumb over her cheek. It was a touch that spoke of regret, of promises, of a future he was now determined to claim. "You were never alone," he said softly. "Even when I didn't remember, my soul knew you." In the echo of his voice, she finally understood. The bond between them wasn't a memory. It wasn't a choice. It was a fact as real and unchangeable as the stone of the citadel around them. He held out his hand. "Together?" She looked at his outstretched hand, then back to his blazing eyes. She saw the boy she had loved. She saw the king he had become. And she saw the future of her son. She placed her hand in his, her fingers lacing through his. His grip was warm and strong and sure. "Together." The tension broke. He nodded to the guards. And as the great doors swung open, revealing the sea of hostile, waiting faces, they stepped across the threshold, not into a trap, but onto their stage. The final battle had begun. The great hall was a sea of watching eyes, hundreds of them, curious, hostile, hungry. The air was thick with the scent of them, wolf and wood smoke, power and suspicion. It was an ocean of judgment, and she was meant to drown in it. At the head of the assembly, on a raised dais, Lord Kale sat beside the empty throne, his face a mask of solemn, false gravity. He looked like a spider in the center of its web. He rose, his voice booming in the sudden, expectant silence. "Let the woman known as Arya Kalin come forward." Every head turned towards her. She could feel the weight of their stares, 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. Beside her, Rowan gave her hand a single, reassuring squeeze before letting it go. "You are not alone." She walked forward, her step steady on the cold stone floor. The journey from the doors to the center of the hall felt like 1,000 miles. She was aware of everything: the flicker of the torches, the scent of burning beeswax, the rustle of a silk gown. She was no longer a ghost. She was the storm. She stopped before the dais, lifting her chin to meet Kyle's cold, triumphant gaze. He thought he had won. He was about to watch his world burn. "You have come before this assembly to confess your crimes against the crown," Kale announced, his voice ringing with authority. "You will tell them of your treason. You will speak the truth." "I will," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the hall. It didn't tremble. It didn't break. The silence that followed was absolute. She turned, not to Kale, but to the assembled pack, to the hundreds of faces staring back at her, and she began to speak. "My name is Arya Kalin," she started, her voice echoing in the vast space. "And I have been accused of being a spy, a traitor, a witch who used her scent to bewitch your king." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "That is a lie." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Kale shot to his feet, his face darkening with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" "You asked for the truth, my lord." A voice like rolling thunder cut him off. And Rowan was there, moving from the shadows to stand beside her. He didn't look at Kale. He looked at his people. "And you will have it." Arya took a breath, feeling his strength beside her, a solid, unshakable wall. "The truth," she continued, her voice rising with a power she never knew she possessed, "is that 5 years ago I met a man. Not a king, just a man. He was kind, and he laughed under the stars, and he made me feel like I wasn't just a girl from a small town." She saw confusion on their faces, disbelief, but they were listening. "That man vanished," she said, her voice thick with the memory of that pain. "He left me alone, and he left me with a child. My family cast me out for the shame of it, and for 5 years I have raised my son alone, loving him fiercely, protecting him from a world that called him a mistake." Murmurs erupted through the hall. "A child?" "And then," she said, her eyes finding Kale's, her voice ringing with accusation, "I came here, and I saw that man again. Only now he wore a crown. And he didn't remember me. He didn't remember our son, because someone had stolen his memories. Someone had lied to him. Someone had lied to all of you." The hall exploded into chaos, shouts, accusations. Kyle's face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. "Lies! She is a traitor, spinning tales to save her own skin." "Is she?" Rowan's voice silenced the room once more. He held up a hand, and in it was a roll of parchment, its seal broken. Fenrir stood near the doors, a bloody cut on his cheek, but his eyes were filled with grim satisfaction. "This," Rowan boomed, "is the original healer's report from the night of my accident. It speaks not of a blow to the head in a border skirmish, but of a potent memory-wiping poison found in my blood. A poison favored by assassins from the northern packs, not the south." He let that truth sink in. "I was not wounded in battle. I was the target of an assassination attempt. A truth my own council, led by Lord Kale, decided to bury. They lied to me. They lied to you. They used my injury to isolate me, to control me." He then turned, his golden eyes blazing, and took Arya's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. They did not want you to know the other truth they buried. He looked at his people, his voice dropping, but filled with an unshakable power. This woman is not a traitor. She is my mate. The collective gasp was a physical force. And the child, he said, his voice ringing with pride and fury. The boy they tried to use as a weapon against her. Leo is my son, my firstborn, and he is your future heir. In the stunning, absolute silence that followed, the truth settled over the great hall. The central question had been answered. The conflict was over, and Arya stood not as a prisoner, but as a queen, her hand held by her king, her past reclaimed, and her future just beginning.
The immediate aftermath was chaos, but it was a righteous chaos. Loyalty, Rowan discovered, was a current that ran deeper than politics. The younger wolves, the ones who valued truth over dusty tradition, surged forward, their voices rising in support of their king. The older families allied with Kael looked stunned, betrayed, their power structure crumbling before their very eyes. "Guards, seize him!" Rowan's voice cut through the noise, and there was no questioning the command. He pointed a single, steady finger at Kael. "Seize them all, for treason against the crown." Fenrir and the royal guard moved as one, their blades drawn. Kael didn't fight. He simply stood there, his face a mask of disbelief, his perfect plan, his lifetime of manipulation all turned to ash in a matter of moments. As they led him and his co-conspirators away, he finally met Rowan's gaze, and in his eyes was not remorse, but the bitter, venomous hatred of a man who had been outplayed at his own game. The moment the doors closed behind them, the tension in the hall broke, replaced by a wave of relief and celebration. But Rowan saw none of it. He only saw her. Arya. She stood beside him, her body trembling slightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The strength that had carried her through the confession was giving way to the sheer, overwhelming emotion of it all. He turned to her, cupping her face in his hands. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick. "Our son," she choked out. "Bring him to me," Rowan commanded, his voice ringing with an authority no one dared defy. It felt like an eternity, but it was only moments. The crowd parted and a healer, her face pale with fear, led Leo into the great hall. The boy's eyes were wide, searching the sea of giant strangers, his small face a mask of confusion. And then, he saw her. "Mommy," he cried, his voice a tiny, perfect sound in the vast hall. He broke away from the healer and ran, his little legs pumping. Arya let out a sob of pure, unadulterated joy and collapsed to her knees, sweeping him up into her arms, burying her face in his hair, murmuring his name over and over again. Rowan watched them, and the cold, empty place in his chest, the phantom limb of his lost past, was suddenly filled with a warmth so profound it almost buckled his knees. This was it. This was what they had stolen from him. This was everything. He walked over and knelt before them, creating a small, private world in the middle of the crowded hall. Leo peeked over his mother's shoulder, his wide, curious eyes, his eyes staring at Rowan. There was no fear in them, only wonder. Rowan reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed a stray curl from the boy's forehead. "Hello, Leo," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Leo looked at him, then at his mother, then back at him. A slow, shy smile spread across his face. In that moment, Rowan was not a king. He was not an alpha. He was just a man, kneeling before his family, his heart finally, miraculously whole. The battle for his kingdom was over. The journey to reclaim his family was complete. And as he looked at Arya, her face streaked with tears but shining with a love that mirrored his own, he knew he was finally truly home.
A month later, she stood on the high balcony where he had first seen her in the courtyard. The wind was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. The Sunstone Citadel no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a home. Her home. The world had shifted, Kale and his followers were awaiting trial. The stories of their treason and of the king's lost son and mate had spread like wildfire, solidifying Rowan's rule in a way no political marriage ever could. There was still work to be done, alliances to mend, and trust to be rebuilt, but the foundation was no longer made of lies. It was made of truth. She heard footsteps behind her and smiled, not needing to turn. She knew his scent. She knew the weight of his presence. "I thought I'd find you here." Rowan's voice was a low, warm rumble beside her ear. His arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against the solid wall of his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and they looked out over the vast expanse of the forest together. "It's peaceful," she whispered. "It is now," he agreed, his voice soft. He was different now. The cold, hard shell of the king was gone, melted away. The boy she remembered from that summer night was back, tempered by the strength and wisdom of the man he'd become. He was whole. They both were. "Leo is with Fenrir," he murmured. "The old wolf is teaching him how to track squirrels. I think Fenrir is enjoying it more than he is." Arya laughed, a real, genuine sound that echoed in the mountain air. Laughter came easily to her now. The shame that had been her constant companion for 5 years was a distant ghost, a story that belonged to someone else. She was no longer Arya Kalin, the disgraced girl. She was Arya, Queen of the Mountain Pack, a title she had not been given, but had earned. "We need to talk about the trade agreements with the valley towns," she said, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "Their harvests were poor this year. They'll need our support." He nuzzled her neck, a low purr vibrating in his chest. "Always the advocate for your people," he teased gently. "They are my people now," she said, and the words felt right. True. She knew what it was like to be hungry, to be an outcast. She would be a different kind of queen. He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes warm and filled with a love that still sometimes stole her breath away. "And you are my queen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My mate. The other half of my soul." He leaned down, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was filled with promises. It spoke of passion, of partnership, and of a future they would build together. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. Below, in the courtyard, she saw a flash of movement. A small boy with dark, unruly hair, chasing a grizzled old wolf around a rosebush, his laughter carrying all the way up to them on the wind. Her son. Their son. Safe. Happy. Loved. She looked at the man holding her, the king who had crossed the chasm of a stolen past to find her. She looked at the child who was their future. And she looked at the vast, wild kingdom that was now her home. The journey had been a nightmare. But as she stood there, wrapped in the arms of her love, with the sound of her son's laughter rising to meet her, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she had finally, truly, woken up in the dream.